Very good. So this is Honduras, and that green area to the upper right is the Reserva de la Biosfera del Rio Plátano. It's a large reserve, but there's a much larger area over there on the right, which is called La Mosquitia, and it covers 20 or 30,000 square miles of both Honduras and Nicaragua, and it actually contains probably the largest preserved unspoiled rainforest in Central America. And also there are areas in here that have never been scientifically explored. Some of the last scientifically unexplored regions on Earth can be found in this area. And here is a Google map picture of it. And you can see where the farming and so forth has eaten away at the jungle. But that big green area in the middle is where the city is located that was discovered. Now, and this area has been known for a long time. Here's a 19th century map. It was called Portal del Infierno. That's actually a typo on that map, but anyway, it means the gates of hell. It was an extremely rugged area where some of the thickest jungle in the world lies on top of extremely steep and rugged mountains, some of them over a mile high. And in the interior of these mountains are valleys that are extremely inaccessible. And it's these valleys, in one of these valleys, where the lost city was discovered. Actually, the story goes back to the 16th century. After Cortez defeated the Aztec Empire in Mexico, he sailed southward along the coast of Central America, and he tried to put down anchor off the coast of Honduras. And it was so deep, the water was so deep there, he was unable to find anchoring ground for a while. So he named it Honduras, which in Spanish, in older Spanish, means profound depth, because he couldn't find an anchorage. But he did land, and he did did some exploration along the coast, and he heard stories from indigenous people of great cities and fabulous wealth in the interior of Honduras. But Coronado wrote about this. He wrote a famous letter back to the Emperor Charles V of Spain, in which he talked about some of these rumors, but he said he was unable to explore into the interior. It was just too rough. But that was the first that anyone ever heard of these sort of cities, lost cities somewhere in this area. But then in the 1840s and 50s, rumors of great lost cities in Central America reached interested people in North America, and a fellow named John Lloyd Stevens he was a New Yorker, a young New Yorker. He managed to wangle a diplomatic appointment down to Honduras, but instead of acting as a diplomat, he immediately set off into the jungle to explore. And he was with a British artist named Frederick Catherwood. And they heard rumors of this great city, and they had indigenous people lead them. And finally, they came across Copan, which is the southernmost Mayan city. And this was the first thing they saw. This is a drawing done by Frederick Catherwood. It was absolutely spectacular. And this news was received with tremendous interest in North America. He published a book called Travels in the Yucatan, etc. And it was actually the biggest selling nonfiction book of the 19th century. But what it showed Americans, European Americans, was that the Americas had great ruins and fabulous antique civilizations equal to anything in Europe. And so it created tremendous excitement. However, and many explorers went down to Central America and discovered many, many Maya cities, and it was quite spectacular, but they never got east of Copan because the jungle got too thick, the mountains were too big, it was just too hard. And so this area east of Copan, in the Mosquitia area in particular, was never explored until the 20th century. And here is one of the first explorations. These are the journals of William Duncan Strong. He was a anthropologist with the Bureau of American Ethnology, which is now part of the Smithsonian, and he explored some of these rivers going into Mosquitia in 1933. And he brought back out many stories. Here's a hand-drawn map of his explorations. He brought out many stories of more lost cities east of Copan that were unknown. And in particular, a city called La Ciudad Blanca, or the White City, sometimes also called the Lost City of the Monkey God by informants, that existed somewhere in this rugged area. And it excited, with tremendous excitement about this. And so the Museum of the American Indian High Foundation, which was in New York and is now part of the Smithsonian, sent a number of expeditions. They sent 4 expeditions looking for this lost city of the monkey god, or the Ciudad Blanca. And the first 3 came back out with all kinds of tantalizing tales, but had not heard of, they weren't able to find it. And finally, they sent this guy named Theodore Mord, who was not an archaeologist, not a geologist. He was, well, pretty much a charlatan, but he was a good talker, and he convinced George Gustav Heye to finance this expedition. And he went into Mosquitia, and he was gone for 6 months. He came back out, and he made an important announcement. He found the lost city of the monkey god, and he brought out a whole bunch of artifacts to prove that he'd found it. And there was great excitement, and this was in 1940. But then he said he was going to go back and excavate as soon as possible, but he refused to reveal the location of the city because he was said that he was worried about looters. And then World War II intervened, and then not long after World War II, Mord committed suicide, and the location of this lost city that he's allegedly found was never established. And people have been frantically looking for it ever since. Now, when I undertook this exploration and writing this book, I managed to dig up Mord's journals, which were very closely held by his family, in a series of weird incidents that I won't go into. I was able to get hold of them and read them. And here is a page from Mord's journal. He had a partner in exploration. And what I discovered from reading these journals, that Mord was a complete fraud, that he did not discover the lost city of the monkey god. In fact, he wasn't even looking for a lost city. He didn't even care about archaeology. What he was really looking for was something else. And he revealed it in his journal. In fact, this journal is full of speculation about this other, much more wonderful thing that he was looking for and he found. Now, you're going to have to read my book to find out what it is. Sorry. But anyway, so let me go back one thing here. So this is the page in his journal where he says, as he's coming out of Mosquitia, out of the jungle, he says, we found nothing. There are no archaeological ruins up here. There's nothing of note. And then he proceeded to buy and dig up artifacts on the coast so that he could claim that he found something to cover up what he was really doing. It's a really fascinating story, and this fraud was just uncovered, and I'm happy to be the one to have uncovered it and set the record straight. So anyway, but getting back, before this fraud was uncovered, there were many people who believed, even legitimate archaeologists, that there was a lost city somewhere in these jungles, and there was many reasons to believe that this was not just a fantasy or a legend, but actually the truth. Not just the legends that indigenous people told archaeologists. There's also tantalizing evidence from archaeology done in the region, not much because it's very hard to work there, of a great civilization that once lived here. A civilization that was somehow somewhat connected to the Maya and to Copan, but not Maya itself, but obviously had a relationship to Copan, because we find in Copan artifacts that are exactly the same as artifacts that were recovered in the Mosquitia jungles by some previous archaeological expeditions. So there was a filmmaker by the name of Steve Elkins who is also has a background in archaeology, but he fell in love with this whole idea of the lost city of the monkey god, and he decided to see if he could raise money for it and find it. And he went to the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, which is a NASA laboratory in Pasadena, California. And they looked at satellite imagery, and they identified an unexplored valley deep in the mountains where it looked like they might be unusual or artificial, curvilinear and rectangular buildings or something underneath this thick jungle canopy. And so in 2012, finally, after 15 years of raising the money, Steve Elkins was able to raise $1 million, was able to put together a scientific team who then explored the region by lidar. And I'm going to explain what lidar is in a second. But first, I want to show you this little New Yorker video that they produced after I wrote an article, which will give you some kind of an interesting overview of the whole expedition.
Oh, and Miles is going to give us the thrill right through the gap. Look at that. There it is. The lost civilization.
We're going to use this point, we've already marked it as our base location. You can roam 10, 15 meters from here, probe out, but I don't want you to go any more than that. If at any point you think, oh bugger, where are they? Get on the whistle. I think you put the chickens in here, don't I?
Yeah, that's what I'm thinking. We just walk back.
Probably gonna go over this and then into the next one, right?
Yeah.
Well, let's not mess around. Let's just go. I know where we are. So let's go up. Let's go up on top of this one and work our way back down that way.
See this?
There's a heap.
There are inscriptions right here.
There are?
Yes. On the edge here,
Oh my
these
God.
decorations anyway.
Wow,
that's it.
wow, look at the ones
This is
that
it.
have.
It's a
Oh, my
Mecate.
goodness,
It's a
look
place
at
where they have
that.
a bunch of Mecates at school.
Wow,
I saw lots of those.
Okay,
20
whoa,
years
whoa,
ago.
whoa, everybody stop. Back up. Don't touch anything. Don't clear anything, please.
Looks like the ears are more of a jaguar. That's what I think it is.
So those ears are 3 months away.
Oh, you think so?
We're celebrating tonight.
Now we're talking.
All right, so what you just saw is sort of an overview. That is footage taken on the expedition. And so the way this began was that in 2012, Steve Elkins and his team teamed up with the National Center for Airborne Laser Mapping at the University of Houston and brought down this little plane, a Skymaster, a Cessna Skymaster, which inside had all the guts torn out, and it carried a $1 million lidar machine. And because this lidar machine had classified electronics in it, it had to be guarded 24/7 while it was in Honduras. So the team hired these Honduran soldiers to guard the plane when it was sitting on the tarmac. And this is on Roatan Island off the coast. And so in May of 2012, starting on May 1st, this plane would take off, it would fly into the interior of Honduras, and then it would spend 6 hours flying a lawnmower pattern over the jungle. I did get to ride in the back of the plane. You can see that there's no seat for me. I was jammed up in the back. It was absolutely the most uncomfortable. It makes flying coach look like traveling in a yacht. It was and the airplane The air conditioning was broken. It was hotter than hell in there, and this was flying low and slow over the jungle for 6 hours, banking back and forth. It was pretty rough. And this is a picture I took of Juan Hernandez, who is running the lidar machine. He's got his laptop computer on top of the lidar machine, and you can see we're flying this lawnmower pattern. And underneath, there's a hole in the bottom of the plane, and a laser, an infrared laser, is firing 125,000 laser pulses a second into the jungle canopy below. And it's measuring the return. And so it's getting billions and billions of points. And it knows the distance to each point. And all this data is gathered by the lidar machine with a very powerful computer, and then is then processed by this machine, and it creates what is known as a point cloud, which is every reflection shows up as a pixel. So you get all the trees and everything else. But even in the thickest jungle, some laser pulses do reach the ground and bounce back up and reach the plane. And so using very sophisticated software, the engineers are able to remove the trees, remove all the reflections from trees to see what is on the ground. Now, we had no idea what we were going to find in this valley. Now, we did have the NASA scientists who said they thought there was something, but that was very vague. And to be honest with you, when I looked at those images, I thought it was more wishful thinking than anything else. But so we flew over the valley. It was about 20 square miles. It took about 3 days of flying. The data was uploaded to Houston and then processed and downloaded. And this is the moment when we saw it. And the incredible thing is that you didn't have to be an archaeologist to see that there was a city there. And I was floored. Now I'm going to demonstrate to you how LiDAR works. This is a part of the LiDAR survey we did, a little tiny piece of it. And it shows each pixel is a reflection from a leaf or a twig or a branch. And you can then use very powerful computation to rotate it and do all kinds of things to it. So here you see the image is being rotated. It can be rotated another way. And then you can lift off the trees. And if you see underneath, there's a structure. And the resolution is about 1 meter, about 3 feet. If it weren't for the trees, we'd have a resolution of about 1 centimeter. But anyway, that just shows you how powerful LiDAR is. So this is a view of the valley in LiDAR in false color, showing the trees. You can remove the trees. And there are all the archaeological features. And here is a map of the valley. And this is huge. This ruin covers over a square mile, and you can see the archaeologists have mapped where the pyramids, the canals, terracing roads, and all sorts of things, all sorts of man-made features in this valley. And here is the center of the area. That where it says cache is where the cache of objects were found that you saw the discovery of. To the right is a pyramid made out of earth, and to the left are plazas and various other features. The entire landscape here has been modified. This is, it's been dug out, smooth, terraced. This was indeed a city. And so, but in 2012, all we had were these LiDAR images, and nothing is really found until it's been ground truth. So in 2015, we all took part in an expedition, a Honduran-American expedition, to explore on the ground. And the only way to get in there really was by helicopter, unless we wanted to spend a month slashing our way through the jungle. So here we are, that's me, and that's Dave Yoder working for National Geographic magazine. The Honduran Air Force helped us out. We also had Honduran Special Forces soldiers, some of whom were indigenous to the jungle. And it was a program where the Honduran government was trying to use indigenous Special Forces soldiers to protect the jungle that they themselves, came from. that this was their home. So the valley itself is quite extraordinary. It's a 20 square miles of gentle terrain, completely surrounded by unbelievably high, steep, inaccessible mountains with only one point of entry. And we're flying through the notch here, the one point of entry. It's absolutely thick with trees. And these trees are triple canopy trees that are up to 150 feet high. But they did find an area we could land in along the river. Just a few trees needed to be cut down, some small ones, slashing some brush. This is a picture I took from the helicopter just as it landed. We had some British former SAS soldiers, jungle warfare soldiers who specialized in jungle expeditions, helping us with the logistics. And here they are running to the helicopter. Here's our landing zone, emptying the helicopter of supplies that were carried in those baskets. And here is the terrain, this beautiful river, absolutely gorgeous river with no name, flowing through this valley. It actually originated in the valley and it flowed out through a single notch in these mountains. And that's the only access point to the valley. And you could really see why people might want to build a city in here, because it was a natural fortress. Here are some of the soldiers we were accompanied by. They loved to have their pictures taken with their guns. And boy, they had some pretty impressive looking guns. And here is our camp. It rained incessantly. It just rained inches every day. Sometimes we were in mud up to our thighs. But it was very interesting. When we first arrived, the animals had never seen people before. And they wandered around unconcerned, except for the spider monkeys, which were furious that we were there. And I remember when I was setting up my tent, they came out of the trees and were on a branch above me and shaking the branch and screeching and throwing flowers at me that they'd been eating from this tree, and very much disturbed by my presence. And when I didn't move, after a while, they just sort of sat on the branch for hours, actually days, watching me and what I was doing, to the point where I kind of wondered, who's in the zoo here, me or them? But, and this was where we had our little kitchen. We had to cut a notch in that tree because it was so big we couldn't get our feet over it to get into the kitchen. But I'll just show you some pictures of the camp, and then I'll move on to some of the discoveries. This was a very important route to a very important place, which was this. I guess you can probably guess what that is. It's just as awful as it looks. You had to be careful not to slip and fall in there either. The first night I was walking back from my tent to where the fire was, and I got a little bit lost because we hadn't quite cleared the jungle. And I was walking around getting really worried. And then I suddenly saw this giant snake coiled up, huge, and it was in striking position and following me with great intensity. So I backed off and I said, "Hey, you guys, there's a big snake here." And so this fellow Woody, who was the logistics leader of the expedition, came over and he said, "Oh, blimey," he's British. He said, "Oh, blimey, that's a fer-de-lance. That's a deadly one." He said, "It's a big one too. Everyone stand back. I'm going to move it." We thought, this is crazy. He's going to move this snake. Is he kidding? Well, he cut a long snake stick with a fork at the end. It was about 7 feet long. And he pinned the snake with it. And the snake started thrashing around and biting. And it was actually venom was squirting through the air, arcs of venom in the night air, because we all had our flashlights on it. And the snake was so big that it was bigger than he, it was taller than he was. So he worked the snake's the fork stick up behind its head, and he grabbed it behind the head, and then it was swiveling its head around and expelled venom all over the back of his hand, and his skin started to bubble. So he wrestled the snake to the ground and took out his knife and cut the head off. Well, that wasn't the end of the fight. The body of the snake continued to fight, and the head was snapping and still spraying venom until he plunged a knife through it and pinned it to the ground. And then when he was done, he got up and he calmly washed his hands and he said, "Nothing like that to concentrate the mind, is there?" So he actually pinned the snake head to a tree because he said, look, this is the deadliest snake in the New World. Its bite is almost always fatal. And where there are one, there are always more. And we need to really put the fear of God into everyone who's arriving, because we were just the advanced group. So here is the head of the snake. I really felt terrible killing this beautiful snake, to be honest with you. Here we are, we come to this unspoiled area, and the first thing we do is murder an innocent animal. So here is our setup. Computers, we flew in generators and computers and everything else. It was quite a setup. And then the day dawned and it was time to go into the lost city that we only had seen on lidar. It was across the river. So we set off into the jungle. The river was like the highway. It's the only easy place to walk. Across the river, we had to go through very dense foliage, which required machetes. We had to cross these mud holes that this one almost swallowed our anthropologist who was sinking, and she was up to her waist, and she said, excuse me, I'm really sinking here. I'm really going down. And they had to rush in and pull her out. It was like this quick mud. It was terrifying. It was like something you'd see in the movies. And this is our archaeologist, Chris Fisher, who is a professor of archaeology at Colorado State University, a Mesoamerican expert and also a lidar expert. Absolutely phenomenally qualified archaeologist. And he brought a team with him, including Honduran archaeologists as well. And this just gives you a sense of how thick the jungle is here. It's just extraordinary. And here we are in the center of the lost city. I've never been so disappointed in my life. You could see nothing, nothing. I mean, even when you were standing 5 feet from the pyramid, you couldn't see it. Here's Chris Fisher standing in the middle of the plaza of this great city. Here is Steve Elkins. This is the slope of the pyramid. You can see these giant trees. He is walking up the side of the pyramid, and I'm on the side photographing him. And even at the top of the pyramid, the trees were 100 feet above our heads. We started to find things. It was very heavily buried in the jungle, including this cache of sacred objects at the base of the pyramid, which on excavation proved to be over 500 objects that had been ritually broken and left at the base of the pyramid when the city was abandoned, probably in around 1520. Here are some of the objects as they were found in the ground. We cleared it out a little bit. Shortly after this picture was taken, a fer-de-lance crawled out from under that log and everyone freaked out. And we had to work around it. We didn't want to kill it, but we kind of tried to keep it from getting too pissed off. But it really slowed down the work, I can tell you. And this was, the first thing I saw was this metate or stone seat. It's not really a metate, it's actually probably a throne of power used by a shaman. This is what they believe to be a weir jaguar. So it's a jaguar, a half jaguar, half human. And so the shaman would sit in the seat and perhaps with the use of hallucinogenic drugs would tap into the power of the jaguar and become transformed into the jaguar. And this is what it looked like after it was excavated. Really interesting and beautiful sculpture that was made entirely with stone. This civilization didn't have metal tools to work with. This just shows how thick the objects were in here. This was when they began the excavation in 2016. Here's Chris Fisher with on the excavation. Everyone just working away. These urns, stone urns, had some mysterious figures on them. There's a great debate about what that figure is. Is it a monkey? Is it a human captive bound for sacrifice? Is it a body bound for burial? No one really knows. But the artifacts were removed and they're now all in my garage. I'm just kidding. They're now all in the museum, either in the Presidential Palace in Tegucigalpa or in the National Museum. For a while there, they were displayed at the American Embassy in Tegucigalpa. But the one of the outcomes of this was that the president of Honduras declared this area, really declared, this area, by the way, is all supposed to be preserved. There's a lot of illegal logging and cattle grazing going on and so forth. It's really eating away at the jungle, but the president really made efforts to preserve this area because of this ruin. And they've, ever since then, they've had a group of officers and soldiers guarding the place so it won't be looted. Although it's so deep in the jungle, it's hard to see how it would be looted. Here's some of the objects covered. Some of these objects seem Maya. This leg here looks like what it has Maya sky symbols on it. And there's that strange figure with a monkey or whatever. And this was found in the center of the cache, and it represents a vulture, or actually a human taking vulture form. And the vulture was sacred to the Maya and probably also to these people because it symbolized both death and resurrection. You know, the vulture was fed on the dead, but then would spiral high into the sky and disappear. So it was sort of a connection between this world and the next. The president of Honduras came and visited. He's on the left there with Steve Elkins, Juan Orlando Hernandez, and his entourage. He was very excited to remove the first object. And then we had a big exhibition of artifacts at the American Embassy in Tegucigalpa. That's the American ambassador, the president, myself, Steve Elkins, and my book. And the Hondurans were very proud of this discovery. You know, the thing about Honduras is that they are, you know, all the news coming out of Honduras that the world sees is all about crime and violence and drug smuggling and just bad news. And, you know, Hondurans, it's a wonderful country with a very warm people. And I think that they felt that this was something positive that they could give to the world that would combat some of the negative images in the world press. And so they put this image on their stamps and were very, very pleased with it. Now, the area still remains mostly unexplored. Here's a picture of that valley that has the ruins all through here that have never been seen or by humans. Here's one, a mountaintop ruin that's quite large. 2 lidar images of it, never been explored. Well, I'm going to wrap up my talk here because I want to get to the questions soon. But I remember when we came out of the jungle, Steve Elkins, we're sitting by the pool in Catacamas at this hotel, and Steve Elkins mopped his brow and he said, "I can't believe that we got in and out of there and nobody got sick and nobody died." Well, his relief was premature, because as the weeks wore on, many members of the expedition started to come down with a bizarre tropical disease. We didn't know what it was at first. It's a single-celled parasite called leishmaniasis, but we didn't know what it was, but it affected 60% of the expedition. Hondurans, Americans, and British alike came down with it. And turned out that the valley was a hot zone of this very horrible, neglected tropical disease called leishmaniasis. And I strongly recommend you do not Google images of people with leishmaniasis. But the National Institutes of Health, run by Anthony Fauci, was very interested in our problem and volunteered to treat all of us for free as part of a research project. So here is where I got the disease along with everyone else. It's not curable, but it's controllable. And so we were treated here, and I had a chance to meet Dr. Fauci. This is before this whole COVID thing. And I had the chance to interview him, and there's an interview with him in the book, The Lost City of the Monkey God, which is very interesting and very prescient. This guy really knows. So then in 2017, Conservation International sent a team down to look at the ecological, at the natural basis, the ecology of this valley. And the team was absolutely floored. They found species in here that they thought were extinct or barely existed in Central America. It was unbelievable. They said this is an area that has never been entered by human beings, at least in centuries, and the animals that were teeming with animals. This is a tape. So they set up these game cameras, or these motion cameras. Here's a tapir was photographed. Here, white-lipped peccaries. Of course, the jaguar. And they even got some film footage here, the white-lipped peccaries crossing a stream. There are hundreds of them. And here's another one. There's the jaguar tracking them. There are tons of big cats in this area. And one night, one of the biologists was out looking for, I'll just tell this quick story. I don't want to go over here because I do know you have questions, but this biologist with Conservation International was out at night looking for glass frogs that he wanted to photograph. And he had to relieve himself. He had to take a pee. So he took a pee and he had a headlamp on, and all of a sudden out of the darkness came a mountain lion, which are very thick in this area. They call them pumas down there. And the mountain lion took one look at him and crouched and stared at him. And the biologist said to me, I know exactly what was going through his head. Food or not food? And he stared at me. They stared at each other for about a minute. And then the mountain lion leapt up and disappeared into the darkness. And that's when he suddenly got scared. He said, oh my God, I turned and I beat the hastiest retreat back to the camp that I could. And I got back to camp and the guys were there and they looked at me and they said, hey, your fly's down. He was so scared he hadn't zipped up his fly. Anyway, that was kind of a cool story. But this area, that now that it's being protected by the Honduran government, it's really a vital area ecologically. It is one of the most untouched jungles in the world. And it's full. This is what it was like before human beings came, really. And then one of the biologists down there saw this animal, a mammal. They didn't get a photograph of it, but they believe it's a new species. That would be a huge discovery to find a new species of animal. So anyway, that is my talk. I want to thank you all for listening. Let's see, I'm going to stop sharing the screen so you can see me again. And so I'm hoping that if you had questions, you might be interested in, I could answer any questions you might have. And so thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Douglas. And we have lots of questions that have been coming in, and I'm going to try to group and paraphrase some of them so that some of the big topics that people have brought up can be answered. You have a lot of fans of your books out there, so people who are asking questions about other novels, I'm going to privilege the topic at hand. So, but first of all, Douglas, people are very concerned about your health. So we've had a lot of questions come in about if you've recovered or if there's side effects, and a little bit about what you experienced there.
Well, I've recovered. I mean, it's a disease that does come back. Your body can't quite get rid of it. But I had wonderful doctors, and I was very fortunate because there are others who were really severely affected, who have not recovered, who have terrible scars from the disease. And remember, do not look online. Don't do that. But they have terrible scars from the disease. So I've been one of the fortunate ones. Thank you for asking.
Good. Well, we're glad that you're doing well. I'm going to try to group a number of topics that have been showing up in the Q&A around the inhabitants of this city and their connection to the modern descendants, indigenous people in this area. So I was wondering if you could speak. There's some curiosity around when the original inhabitants left the site and what were the circumstances around that, and the connections to modern indigenous people in the area. If you're able to speak to that a bit.
Those are really good questions. The theory that Chris Fisher has, and the archaeologists who worked on the team, is that the city was abandoned in 1520, around that time, because of European disease. Now, the Spanish never got anywhere near this city, but in the early 1500s, the Spanish were running slave operations on the coast, capturing people, taking them off to the mines and the plantations and to the islands. And So many people fled the coast and went inland and deep inland, carrying with them European disease. In my book, I have a very careful analysis. I've analyzed a number of Spanish accounts and later accounts, a very careful analysis of what happened in Honduras specifically. And it looks like measles killed a very large percentage of the population, followed by smallpox and perhaps influenza and other European brought diseases. So the theory is that what happened here in the city is that even though the city was massively protected by the jungle and the mountains, the European disease got in there. The mortality was probably 90 to 95%. And the few survivors took all their sacred objects, piled them up at the base of the pyramid, broke them, which was a common sacred action done in the New World to release the spirit of an object, and then walked out of the jungle 500 years ago and never came back. And we were the first human beings in there in 500 years to come across that sacred area. So I talk a lot in my book about what they call the Colombian Exchange, which is sort of a nice way of putting the absolute horrific pandemics that swept the New World, brought over from Europe, and that probably did wipe out 90 to 90% of the indigenous inhabitants. And many of those people died way ahead of Spanish exploration. The disease traveled faster than the Spanish did. And so often you see early Spanish accounts and English explorers and French of coming across these native villages that are completely abandoned or only a few old people left and so forth. So the last part of my book talks about that. And it also talks about the disease of leishmaniasis. And that's where we had a chance to interview Dr. Fauci, who talked about pandemics. This was in 2016. And he said, it's coming. It's coming. And it did, it came.
Thank you very much.
No, wait, did I answer all of that question though? Because there was another question there about, I just want to make sure I answered all parts of that question.
Yeah, I had kind of grouped some questions from the audience, but there was also an emphasis on maybe the interactions that you have had with this indigenous descendant communities. Right.
Yes, that's right. Well, we had an anthropologist who was from, she was an anthropologist from the Smithsonian, but originally from Mexico. And she, the closest indigenous community to where we were was a town called Wampu-Sirpi, which is along the Patuca River. It's only reachable by river or by helicopter. So she went there in helicopter with some of the special forces soldiers who were with us were also Tawaka or Mosquito Indians, others from indigenous people from this area. Anyway, went to this village and she was able to talk to them, tell them what we were doing, and she collected some very interesting stories that they told her about the Ciudad Blanca, the lost city, and what happened to it. And it's interesting that their stories mesh with what we think happened, which is they said, look, the city was a series of disasters befell the city, and the people, thinking the gods were angry, left, leaving all their possessions behind, and anyone who returned would die. So, it does sound like a pandemic situation, description and legend. So at Wampu-Sirpi, there are a lot of wild cacao trees that grow in this area. And one of the things they do is that they make raw chocolate that they then send down the river in canoes and sell. And some of this chocolate is considered to be the best chocolate in the world. It really commands a huge premium, this Wampu-Sirpi, this chocolate from these wild chocolate trees in the rainforest. And it's quite certain that, to the Maya, chocolate was sacred, and cacao beans were sometimes used as currency. And so it's absolutely, likely that the Maya were trading chocolate and cacao pods with the people who lived in this area, this civilization, which, by the way, doesn't really have a name. It's so unknown. The ancient people of Mosquitia is how I refer to them in my book.
Thank you. That's really good explanation and description. There's a lot of questions about the contribution to knowledge that was made by this expedition, and then what the are there any other plans to continue work? Has excavation continued? Maybe what happened after the fact with respect to the archaeology and the science here?
Well, it's a really good question. The Hondurans, the history of Honduras is a bifurcated history. There's a European aspect to the history, and there's an indigenous aspect. And most Hondurans are mestizo. They have ancestry in both the New World and the Old World. Now, the Spanish and the European history of Honduras is very well known, but the local indigenous history outside of the Maya is almost unknown. And so the Hondurans were fascinated with this project because this is their history. This is their patrimony. And so they also were very interested in this as a training ground to develop Honduran archaeology. So the airport that we used outside of Catacamas had originally been built by the CIA during the Iran-Contra wars. And it was pretty much abandoned, but it was had a very good runway. And so the Hondurans came back in and they built a barracks there for soldiers going in and out of the jungle. And then they built an archaeological laboratory. So these objects that are coming out of the jungle can be then conserved in this laboratory. It's a training ground for young Honduran archaeologists to learn the profession, because up to this point in Honduras, most of the archaeology being done in Honduras was being done by Mexican archaeologists, because Mexico is a very sophisticated archaeological culture. And so, like, for example, the head of Honduran archaeology was actually Mexican, and he was on our expedition. But so they wanted to develop their indigenous archaeological programs, and that's what they're doing. So, so they're not only preserving the city, they don't have any plans to open it to tourism, which is not possible, really. It's a very dangerous area in terms of disease and snakes and so forth. But they don't want to continue excavating it either. They want to leave it as is. And then they want to use it as a way to develop their own archaeological students.
Oops, sorry, just getting myself back here. Thank you. And that actually answered some other questions that had come up about whether or not Honduran students and archaeologists might be interested in this kind of scholarship as well. I think that I might be in trouble if I didn't at least ask one of the questions that have been coming up throughout the Q&A here. With now that we're right at 5 o'clock, so this might be a good one to wrap up with, which is, do you have any plans or interest in integrating this into your fictional novels and characters?
Well, that's a really interesting question, because this is what I often do, and those of you who read my thrillers, read my books, and who also follow my work in the New Yorker have seen multiple times where I've done a story, for the New Yorker magazine, and then two or three years later, all of a sudden a novel comes out based on the same type of subject. And this actually happened with the first magazine article I wrote, was actually for Smithsonian Magazine on the Oak Island treasure. That became my novel, Riptide, with Lincoln Child, written with Lincoln. The work I did on prehistoric cannibalism in the Southwest, and Christy Turner's work became the basis for Thunderhead, which is a novel that we republished. And so on it goes. So the lost city of the monkey god, it does seem like a wonderful place for perhaps Nora Kelly, a character in our books who's an archaeologist, to explore, or maybe even Pendergast himself. So yes, everything I learn in life I pour into my novels.
Well, it sounds like there's a lot of people who are eagerly awaiting your next novel, and have mentioned in the chat and in the Q&A that they will, if they haven't read The Lost City of the Monkey God yet, that they will work on this while they're waiting for your next Pendergast novel. So
Well, thank you
So-
very much.
I think so. We're just about out of time. So I just want to thank you so much for joining us, Douglas, and thank you for all of the kind words about Crow Canyon. And it's been really fun to get to know you and be able to hear more details and see some of the fantastic video about this trip.
Well, thank you, Liz. It's really a pleasure, and thank you everyone who attended. I really appreciate you listening to my blathering. It's always nice to have someone hear me.
Not at all. Not even a bit of blathering.
Right.
That's our forte around here. So, all right. Thank you to everyone, and we hope to see you next Thursday.
Thank you. Bye-bye now.
Bye, everyone.